Good afternoon, everybody. So today we are kicking off our discussion of American history from the first colonization to 1865 by talking about who are the first Americans and who were the people that encountered the first Americans when Europeans first came to the so-called New World. So, who were the first Americans and who were the people of the Old World? And the question of who the first Americans were is one that scholars are still really debating. For a long time, the common understanding has been that the first Americans migrated from Siberia in Northeast Asia and they went across the Bering Strait to Alaska and from there spread down into North, Central, and South America over the course of thousands of years. And it's been thought that the first wave of migration happened around 13,000 years ago during an ice age that made it possible to trek across the channel that separates Siberia from Alaska. The main archaeological evidence of these people and their journey consists of what are known as Clovis points. And they were named after the place, Clovis, which you can see here on the map in New Mexico, where these Clovis points were first discovered in the 1920s and 1930s. And these are carefully carved spear points. And they've been found in locations all throughout North and South America. The farthest south that we found is all the way down in Venezuela. The oldest of these, securely dated, goes back to about 13,500 years ago or so. And for a long time, it was assumed that because you had the rapid spread of these tools, that there was a common culture throughout the Americas. In recent years, though, there are a lot of different archaeological sites that have emerged that challenge this theory. And some of these sites, located in places as diverse as Oregon, Pennsylvania, Texas, British Columbia, Chile, and Brazil, some of these sites date human habitation going all the way back to 15 to 20,000 years ago. And there have been a variety of theories proposed for how these early North Americans may have arrived here. The most popular theory being that these people actually came by boat following the Pacific coastline down. So you can see that in this map here. There is, of course, the traditional idea that people crossed the Bering Strait and came down into North America that way, but it could also be that people followed the coastline and came down all the way down into South America much earlier than we had previously thought. What we do know about these first Americans is that they were probably hunter-gatherers. They were living and traveling in small groups, maybe 15 to 50 people each. They used wooden stone-tipped spears to hunt, and they were a highly nomadic people. They followed the herds of large mammals that populated the grasslands in North America. And there was a lot of food, and there was a temperate climate, and so they prospered and they multiplied. And so much so that by about 9,000 years ago, people were inhabiting the entire length of North America from Alaska down to the southern tip of South America, which was a distance of around 8,000 miles. So they spread all throughout the Americas. As the Ice Age receded and as the largest mammals began to die out, the environment also began to change. The grasslands shrank, the forests expanded, and these early first Americans had to adapt. They began to do a lot more gathering, nuts, seeds, berries, plants, and they started to do more fishing, and they developed new hunting weapons that were much more useful at catching smaller animals. The population continued to grow and they began to settle down in these semi-permanent villages. And they also began to modify their environment. As these bands spread and as they began to specialize in harvesting particular local resources, they became culturally different as well. They developed different languages, different rituals and mythologies and social organization systems. And so, by the eve of European colonization, the native peoples in North America spoke at least 375 different languages. But these groups were not necessarily isolated from each other. There's a lot of evidence that there were trade networks that developed over long distances, and ideas and information also flowed along these trade routes. So it was a very diverse population, but Native American societies did share some common characteristics, particularly regarding their general religious beliefs and views about the nature of power. So animism is a term that anthropologists use to describe the belief system or the worldview of many indigenous people, including Native Americans. And it is the belief that there is no distinction between the natural world and the supernatural, that everything in nature, including animals, plants, bodies of water, mountains, the sun and the moon, the earth itself, and human beings, everything has a spirit or a soul. Everything or everyone, both in this world and in the next, in the underworld and in the so-called sky world, embodied or conveyed or possessed power. And so for Native Americans, there is really no distinction between the natural and the supernatural. And this power was associated with a vast range of persons. Everything in nature has a spirit, so it can be kind of considered a person. That's where that term animism comes in. And most of these persons were not human. They were non-human persons. So the sun, the rain, wind, the earth itself are other than human persons who have the same kinds of emotions, the needs, motives, strengths, weaknesses, just like human beings do. And features of the natural world, animals, plants, bodies of water, mountains, lakes, rivers, these are also other than human persons. And indigenous people believed that humans lived within this world, within this web of the natural and supernatural, rather than being set apart from it. So in the Native American, as I said, in the Native American worldview, there are these human persons and then there are these other than human persons. And people and other than human people are kind of regularly interacting with each other. And they conceived of their actions with all other beings as essentially social. And so in Native American mythology, people and other than human people could change into each other. There were also gods, ancestors, great sort of primordial animals who were sort of present at the time of creation, trickster figures, personal guardian spirits, even one's own soul that could leave and return to a person's physical body. And so the dead, the unborn, they are also sort of beings of power. So they're all connected with this web of power, and human persons, you have to ally yourselves with both human and other than human persons to channel that power in a productive way. And so the key here is reciprocity. Taking what you needed from nature, honoring those forces, and minimizing waste. This is not to romanticize Native American animism as some kind of utopian, new agey sort of worldview. The natural and the spiritual world in the Native American worldview were bound together and inseparable from each other. And it was a dangerous place. It was a volatile place. Native Americans usually showed a lot of restraint in their dealings with nature, not because they had a sort of modern understanding of environmental science or ecology, but because they were afraid of what the spirits dwelling in animals and plants and natural features of the world, they were afraid of what those spirits could do to them. And you could communicate with those spirits through dreams, visions. The sort of people who were most adept at this became shamans who could act as intermediaries between people and other than human persons. So we see this reflected in Native American creation stories. It's a very interesting, if you read any Native American creation stories, they provide a very interesting perspective on this sort of animistic worldview. In addition to animism and sort of this belief system, Native American groups also shared a lot of general mechanisms underlying the mobilization of power and how leadership is structured in their societies. First and most fundamental were ties of kinship. And the most effective source of collective power in Native American societies was a large, multi generational household. And in most cultures, sort of kinship or lineages were part of these larger groupings called clans that united people across multiple communities. And everyone in the clan, women and men, elderly and young people, wives and husbands, parents and children, everyone contributed to the group. Everybody had a role to play. And in a world that was basically defined by these ties of kinship, people who were outside the clan, people who were outside the tribe or who had no kin, really had no defined place. And perhaps they were even other than human. And so in war, captives, conquered villages, they were either, if they could not be sort of transformed into kin through some kind of ritual adoption, they could be killed or they could be enslaved. Now, keep this in mind. These ties of kinship are going to be very important when we think about how the first Americans responded when these entirely new people show up on their doorstep, effectively. How do they respond when these people who, aren't part of the clan, who don't have these ties of kinship, suddenly appear? Native American sort of power alliances are basically based around sort of economic obligations through gifting and sort of sharing of resources. Native Americans in medieval North America did not exchange goods or labor, other resources in a system that Europeans would recognize as buying and selling. Instead, there was a lot of exchanges that went on, but these were sort of framed as gifts. But gifting was competitive. It was not some kind of utopian world where everyone's just sort of sharing things and everyone's living in harmony and generosity. Gifting is competitive. Prestige, social status, political influence went to those who are able to give material and cultural resources away, and through that create these unequal bonds of obligation. So if you give something to someone else, they are bound to you and they have to, reciprocate in some way. And so this is a way, sort of that people exchanged resources and, sort of established social status and prestige and sort of who was in charge, essentially. A third sort of source of power and alliances was the ability to control access to resources and human resources, material resources outside the community. And these could be exchanged either through warfare or through diplomacy. Warfare was very endemic in North America prior to European contact, just as it was in Europe at the time. Like most societies in human history, Native Americans glorified warfare and kind of violence in war, but it was also very limited. And it was mainly about securing access to resources or restoring the power of the tribe by conquering, killing, absorbing other people into the tribe through ritual adoption. So again, keep that in mind when we're thinking about how do Native Americans, sort of respond when these entirely new people come in, and when violence does occur. Diplomacy was also important, and as I mentioned, goods exchanged in gifting ceremonies, these were visual displays of power. And so a successful leader could mobilize those goods on behalf of his kin and community and use them to bind other people to him. So, as I mentioned, by about 9,000 or so years ago, Native Americans had spread all throughout North and South America. And over many, many generations, farming began to evolve from the practice of gathering wild plants. And there were really three major crops that were developed by Native Americans in central Mexico. And these are the crops of beans, corn or maize, and squash. And as these crops became more and more important in their diet, the people of Central America began to devote less and less time to hunting and gathering and fishing. And their population grew, and growing these crops, corn in particular, required very careful tending and care. And so we start to see more permanent villages developing. Farming also produces economic differentiation and social stratification because there's now a food surplus. Some people are able to specialize. They become craftsmen, they become merchants, they become priests, they become even rulers. These three crops don't come together to become the major staples of the Central American diet by accident. They actually work together very, very well in harmony to create a pretty nutritious diet. By itself, a diet exclusively of corn isn't actually very healthy. In fact, if you only eat corn, you will actually get sick. It's a disease called pellagra. But if you combine corn and beans, you get all the necessary amino acids that produce healthful nutrition. What's more important is that corn and beans can be stored. They can be dried and they can be stored for years. And squashes have a lot of vitamins, vitamin C, vitamin B. So all these three crops together give you a very well balanced diet. And you could add in a little bit of fish or a little bit of meat once in a while, but the people of Central America could really survive on these three major crops alone. Prior to about 900 of the Common Era, these crops were grown exclusively in Central and South America. And north of the Rio Grande River, hunting, fishing, gathering, that was really the primary means of subsistence for Native Americans in North America, in what would become later the United States. But between 900 and 1300, the climate begins to change. Summers become longer, weather becomes warmer and more predictable. Gradually, you see the three staples of corn, beans, squash begin to spread northward. And this is a period that one historian has termed the medieval warm period. And so we start to see farming on a large scale begin to take off in the American Southwest. Eventually that spreads into the Midwest and into the Southeast, even in some of the more temperate areas in the Northeast. And this was really transformative for Native American societies in these areas. Not all Native American societies embraced agriculture. Some people lived in areas where the growing season was too short, there's not enough water, or there's so much abundance to hunt and fish and gather, like in the Pacific Northwest and in California, that agriculture just simply wasn't necessary. But in those areas that did develop strong agricultural production, we see very complex and populous cultures emerging. And three of those, the Hohokam, the Anasazi, and the Cahokia, are, sort of three major ancient Native American societies emerging in the Southwest and the Mississippi River Valley during this period. These cultures practiced very complex irrigated agriculture, and they built these large, elaborate structures that we can still see today. They developed these incredibly sort of large structures, as you can see in some of these photographs here. We don't know what these people called themselves. These names, Hohokam, Anasazi, Cahokia, these are names that, modern scholars have given to these ancient peoples. We don't know what they called themselves, but we do see, sort of these cultures developing. And these elaborate structures, sort of eventually these cultures began to decline. They experienced likely environmental crises that meant that most of these cultures had collapsed prior to the arrival of the Europeans. But you can still see evidence of these sort of large scale societies even today. So, what does North America kind of look like in the years leading up to the first sustained contact between Europeans and North Americans? So, this is kind of roughly, this map shows roughly what the tribal distribution in North America looked like on the eve of first sustained contact between Europeans and Native Americans. There were many different Native groups. They all had different political systems, different religious beliefs, hundreds of different languages. The most striking feature of Native American society at the time when Europeans arrived in large numbers was its sheer diversity. During the medieval warm period, about 900 to about 1300 or so, agriculture, as I mentioned, the three crops, maize, beans, and squash, and the way of life that was based around these agricultural practices basically took hold almost everywhere that it could, almost everywhere that the climate allowed for it. Agriculture was so transformative that if you look at Native American origin stories, a lot of them talk almost universally about the introduction of corn, beans, and squash as almost a kind of a founding spiritual gift given to the original people, as if there was no time when these crops had not existed and sort of been the basis for their society. The vast majority of North American societies that encountered Europeans after 1492 were farming societies. Now, on the other side of the Atlantic, we have Europeans, and they are just like we see in North America with the building of, sort of the Anasazi, the Hohokam, Cahokia. Europeans are building their own monuments to their own agriculturally based civilization. We can definitely compare the great Gothic cathedrals of Europe to the mounds, the earthen mounds of Cahokia, or the walls of the adobe that the Hohokam developed. They took cathedrals just like these mounds often took generations to build. The amount of labor and materials that they could mobilize using very simple technology was pretty astonishing. These were places that focused human attention upon the supernatural world. They were places that were associated with the remains of the dead. They both displayed collections of rare, spiritually charged artifacts. They drew pilgrims coming to these places from all over the place for rituals. They were sites of political power. And these monuments were made possible because the same changes in climate that were happening in North America were also happening in Europe at the same time. There are dramatic changes in food production in Western Europe that coincide during this period of the medieval warm period from about 900 or the 10th and 11th centuries, going up into kind of the beginnings of the sort of late medieval period. And the central innovation here was the three-field system of crop rotation. This began to take hold in Northern Europe during the 10th and 11th centuries. And they also were starting to use new technologies as well. So they could cultivate more land. And that meant that the diet of ordinary people started to become much more diverse. And that allowed for a growth in population. In the 11th century, beginning in the 11th century, all up through about the 14th century, Western Europe's population roughly tripled. And there were a lot of new social and political forms that were associated with this agricultural revolution that was happening in Western Europe. And this was a very violent period in European history. Again, there are a lot of parallels with what's going on in North American societies. Both sides glorify war. Both sides elevate violence as a social spectacle. And both sort of societies are kind of ruled by this warrior class. So the medieval Western European ruling class, people who had titles like knight or lord or king, these are the descendants of people who had terrorized, thugs who had terrorized the region's population after the fall of the Roman Empire. Strong men with private armies, basically gangs of heavily armed horsemen, offered weaker peoples protection from other marauding bands of warriors. And they developed a system known as the vassal or the feudal system. And in this system, you have, of course, it's this very hierarchical system where you have at the top is the king or the monarch, and then below them you have sort of smaller nobles who owe allegiance to stronger ones. And at the very bottom of the hierarchy are the vast majority of ordinary people who supported the noble class. And so there's this multi-level system. Everyone is seeking an opportunity to extort labor, resources from those below them. And power basically rests not just in, military might, economic might, but they also have, those who are on top have the right to give out justice. They have the right to appoint priests and give land and other privileges to people. And so there are lots of different methods of wielding authority in this feudal system. All of this sort of rests upon property, land, and the right to the labor of those who work the land. It's really the key to nearly all wealth. And wealth brings power. It allows you to reward men who fight for you, who allow you to acquire further wealth, who defend the wealth that you have. And kings acquire land through conquest. So basically, killing your neighbor and taking his land. The free grant of land by your subjects. Essentially, you could extort land from people who, you would threaten. And inheritance, which of course is a polite term for profiting from the theft and extortion that your ancestors have been practicing. And so society is kind of knit together in this pyramid of protection and obligation. And of course, the vast majority of people are at the bottom of the pyramid, and they have virtually no power at all. In this system, even male peasants, like male heads of household, like all male heads of household, they have the right to exploit at least some other people's labor, the labor of their wives and their children. And compared to the very close kinship bonds that define North American communities, medieval European families are much less extended and communal and much more nuclear. So in this society, it's really true that a man's home is his castle. There's a very definite gender hierarchy as well, which is, of course, reinforced by the church. And by legal codes that denied women the right to possess property of their own. And it's really, sort of this very hierarchical society. So you want to keep this in mind when we are talking about, again, how do we sort of square things when two very different societies come together? One of the big differences between Europeans and Native Americans is their belief systems. So in contrast to the animism that a lot of indigenous people of North America practiced, Europeans had begun to conceptually separate the natural and the supernatural. Christianity, which had become the dominant religion in medieval Europe by this time, Christianity invests supernatural power in a single judgmental God, living far away in heaven, removed from the earthly realm. Most 16th and 17th century Europeans, people in the 1500s, 1600s, they continued to believe in supernatural intervention, but it was something that came from without. Uh, they believed that, sort of supernatural, the supernatural world intervened in the material world, but they saw it as coming from without. It wasn't sort of from within, like you see with animism. The god of medieval Europe was a judgmental god. Medieval Christianity is very much a religion that's focused upon this all powerful judge slash king who, on the last day, would wield his sword and cast his enemies into hell and grant pardon for those who acknowledge him and who had paid for their sins. And so you see in medieval churches, on the walls of medieval churches, you'll see there are these sort of gruesome images of the Last Judgment that are designed to encourage Europeans to give alms to the poor, to contribute to the building of cathedrals, to feed and clothe the armies of the king, to sort of pay this homage to God, just like they paid homage to their local lord or their king on earth. They would have to pay that homage to the king in heaven. So this belief in this God, this transcendent God that is separated from the natural world, enabled Europeans to disenchant the world, to see the world as purely material, to see animals as being just part of that natural world. They don't have souls. They don't have a spirit that you necessarily need to honor. And this justified Europeans harvesting all the resources that they wanted from nature. And so, in fact, European Christians insisted that humanity was actually given a divine charge from God to dominate and exploit the natural world. If you read through the book of Genesis, that is sort of exactly what it says. It says that God wants mankind to, sort of have dominion over the earth. And so this sort of anthropocentric implications of Christianity is connected, and it enables Western Europeans to begin to develop an economic culture of what becomes known as mercantile capitalism by the 16th and 17th century. So in capitalist societies, you have the means of production, land, labor, capital, everything being privately owned. Everything can be bought and sold. And all of those sort of, things, land, labor, should be devoted to harvesting or making commodities that can be sold in pursuit of profit. And it demands a lot of work from people. It demands taking much more energy and much more material from nature than societies that ascribe to this idea of animism. So it demands sort of ever greater production, innovation. There's sort of this relentless drive. And it encourages people to harvest wealth from nature as quickly as possible. So again, keep this in mind when we're thinking about what happens when these two very different societies come together. Now, at the beginning of the 15th century, so we're talking 1400 or so, if you had told a European king or queen that 100 years from now, their kingdom would have expanded commercially and geographically, that there would be all kinds of new lands in Africa and the East Indies and the Americas, they would have looked at you like you were absolutely crazy. The idea that Europeans, by the end of the century, would begin to venture outside of Europe to explore and conquer distant lands, this was something that was totally improbable. In 1400, this is what Europe basically looks like. Europe is an inward-focused group of different peoples who are preoccupied with fighting endless wars amongst themselves. Europe is also slowly recovering from the Black Death, which in the 1340s had killed about a third of the European population. And they are not terribly interested in science or technology. Their spiritual and intellectual leaders usually insisted that everything worth knowing had already either been discovered by the ancient Greeks or had been revealed by God through the Bible. And those who were interested in exploring science and technology very much risked being prosecuted for heresy by the church. At the beginning of the 15th century, the greatest empire in the world is not the Spanish or the French or the English, but the Islamic Empire, dominated by the Ottoman Turks. They were in control, as you can see, of basically all of North Africa, the sort of Eastern Mediterranean, Spain, the Balkans, the Near East, Central Asia, Southeast Asia. The trade routes of the Muslim world go from Morocco to the East Indies and from Mongolia to Senegal. Arabic is the language of law and commerce and government and science. And European Christians are feeling kind of hemmed in by this. They are constrained by the superior wealth and power and technology that the Islamic Empire possesses. They believe they're at the losing end. They're on the losing end of a long struggle for the future of humanity. Over the last 300 years, Europeans had spent an enormous amount of blood and treasure in these series of crusades, bloody, humiliating attempts to capture and hold the city of Jerusalem. And then in the middle of the 15th century, the Ottoman Turks invade southeastern Europe and they capture the city of Constantinople in 1543. This created in Europe a powerful sense of claustrophobia, a real sort of longing to figure out some way to get out of this sort of the tiny little corner of the world that they had been sort of boxed into, and how can we circumvent this vast Muslim empire? European leaders believed that the power of the Islamic Empire was fueled by the wealth that was generated by their control of the most lucrative trade routes. European consumers were paying very high prices to Muslim merchants for gold and ivory and silks and gems and spices from Africa and Asia. And this was all enriching the Islamic world and draining wealth from the European Christian world. So Europeans desperately wanted to weaken what they saw as their enemy, the Islamic Empire, and enrich themselves by finding some kind of alternative trade route to sub-Saharan Africa and East Asia that they could bypass these Muslim merchants and these tax collectors and be able to get around the Islamic world somehow. So Europeans are inspired by fantastic tales of people going to the Far East, to China and India. The printing press gets invented by Johannes Gutenberg around 1440. This lowers the costs and increases the volume of book publishing. And especially popular become these accounts of all the wealth and power that is flowing in India and China. So inspired by all these fantastic tales, Europeans really longed to reach the Far East. But it's not just trade in exotic items that motivated Europeans to break out. It's also religion. If we look at the introduction to Columbus's diary that he presents to Queen Isabel and King Ferdinand, we can see another powerful motivating factor. So I'm going to read a little bit from this introduction here. He starts off by saying, "This present year of 1492, after your highnesses had brought an end to the war with the Moors," he's referring here to the Spanish king and Queen Isabel and King Ferdinand kicking the Muslims out of Spain. He says, "Because of the report that I had given to your highnesses about the lands of India and about a prince who is called Grand Khan, which means in our Spanish language, King of Kings, how many times he and his predecessors had sent to Rome to ask for men learned in our holy faith in order that they might instruct him in it, and how the Holy Father had never provided them. And thus so many peoples were lost, falling into idolatry and accepting false and harmful religions. and your highnesses, as Catholic Christians and princes, lovers and promoters of the holy Christian faith, you thought of sending me, Cristobal Colon, to see how their conversion to the holy faith might be undertaken. So I think this is really interesting. What he is saying is driving Columbus and his patrons, the King and Queen of Spain, to venture outward. It's not just economics, right? It's also this same spirit that had caused Europeans to embark on the Crusades in the previous centuries. It was considered the responsibility of Christian monarchs to enlarge not just their kingdom, but the kingdom of God. And places in this vast unknown territory called the Indies that are either uninhabited or who are occupied by people who don't believe in Christianity, these places rightfully belong to the church, at least according to, sort of Europeans. It was the obligation of Christian monarchs and knights to bring these places into submission and to turn their labor to the profit of their godly conquerors. So if Europeans could somehow bypass the Muslim world and get to the Far East, they could enlist the people and the wealth there for one last final climactic crusade against Islam. And so this is really the other sort of thing that is driving European expansionists. So this really begins in Spain and Portugal, in the Iberian Peninsula. And as I mentioned, in 1469, the marriage of Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, they unite Spain, and they create what is known as modern Spain by marrying together the kingdoms of Aragon and Castile. Isabella and Ferdinand are very, very religious. They are very expansionist, and by 1492 they had completed what became known as the Reconquista, and they had driven out the last Muslim stronghold. They seized the city of Granada and driven the Muslims out of Spain. So taking back the Iberian Peninsula from the Muslims had been a very long process, and it had been one that proceeded according to a very particular pattern. And we're going to see this pattern repeated when we get to the conquest of the New World. So typically, the monarch would issue a license to an adelantado, an advancer, who would agree to raise the funds and the troops necessary to conquer a particular town or fortress for the crown and the church. And if he succeeded, the adelantado would get a noble title and the right to govern the area and its surviving population. They would have an estate there, and they could get a share of whatever they could plunder. The adelantado would then recruit people to follow him, and they could then also expect to share in the profits and the land and the rights to command the labor of the people who were living there. So it's a very attractive prospect for a lot of up-and-coming Spaniards. A conquistador, or a conqueror, could become lord and master of vast domains of land. Technology also plays a role here. During the 15th century, the Spanish and Portuguese developed these new ships. They developed new navigation techniques, geographic knowledge, weapons that are going to enable their voyagers, their mariners, to sail around the globe and to dominate peoples in distant lands. And so they begin to kind of venture southward along the Atlantic coast of West Africa. And they discover 3 sets of islands in the eastern Atlantic. These islands had valuable commodities, and some of these islands, as we're going to see, were also populated, and the people there could be enslaved. Eventually, you see, they begin to colonize these islands. They begin to colonize and create outposts along the African coast. They begin to settle along these areas. So the Spanish are kind of a little bit late to the game here. It's the Portuguese who really do this first, and they establish this vast trading empire with bases in India and southern China and Indonesia. The Spanish then have to find, almost by default, a western route to the Indies, and this is really where an Italian mariner from Genoa, Italy, Christopher Columbus, comes in. Columbus, of course, popularly is sort of, there's this very popular story that about Columbus that, unlike most other people in his era, he believed the earth was round, and so he sets off on this improbable voyage across the Atlantic in search of the fabled Indies. In reality, Columbus was a very devout religious zealot. And he actually drew upon the Bible for his theories on geography. He was really hoping to convert Asians to Christianity and recruit them in this kind of final crusade to crush Islam. And he, like most Europeans at the time, he knew the earth was round. This was common knowledge. The idea that medieval Europeans believed the earth was flat is a total outright fiction. He was also a pretty talented and experienced navigator, but he ended up making a mistake. He knew that if he sailed west, he would reach what he believed would be Asia. And from reading other sources, he kind of argued that the Asian continent was actually twice as wide as it actually is. And he thought that the latitude of the globe was only about 3/4 of the distance that we now know to be accurate. So he thought getting to the east by going west, that this would be a relatively short trip. So he tried to find, sort of people who would back this voyage. And eventually he sort of comes to Spain. The Spanish monarchs provide him with 3 ships. They sort of argue that even if he failed to reach Asia, he might find some valuable new islands. No one anticipated, of course, that there were any large continents in the way. And Europeans were not afraid necessarily to sail west to get to Asia because they were worried they would sail off the edge of the world. That's a total fiction. What they realized was that the actual size of the earth is pretty big. 15th century Europeans knew that the globe had a circumference of around 24,000 miles. Columbus, on the other hand, thought that the circumference of the earth was about 18,000 miles. So this very critical and possibly fatal mistake that he had made inspired his confidence that he could find Asia. He was actually really lucky that he ended up running into a previously unknown continent. This allowed him to gain fresh water and provisions before his men decided to actually mutiny. So when he sort of set out, he eventually ends up reaching the islands of the Bahamas and encounters sort of these islands in the Caribbean. He thinks, of course, that these are the East Indies. And even though the people that he encountered, the Taino Indians, they were unlike any people he had seen or read about, he insisted on calling them Indians, and that's where that term comes from. From the start, Columbus treated the Caribbean Indians and the islands of the Caribbean and their inhabitants as places and people that could be rendered into commercial plantations to be worked by enslaved labor. He sets up a colony. He sort of ends up trying to, enforce the labor of the inhabitants of the New World. He eventually sails back to Spain. He's given a hero's welcome. And thanks to the newly invented printing press, word of Columbus's voyage and discovery spreads rapidly and widely throughout Europe. The Spanish and the Portuguese, with the help of the Pope at the time, negotiate in 1494 a treaty called the Treaty of Tordesillas, which grants the Portuguese the right to exploit the coast of Africa and the Indian Ocean, and it gives the Spanish the right to Columbus's discoveries in the West. They literally, as you can see from this map here, they literally draw a line down the world, and they say that the Portuguese are they're in charge of everything to the right of that line, and the Spanish get everything to the left. Of course, no one bothered to consult the Native Americans. The other Western European kingdoms, the French, the English, they didn't like this treaty. They refused to recognize it. They said, hey, the Pope doesn't have the authority to keep us from exploiting and exploring these new lands. But no one, of course, is arguing that the inhabitants of the New World should be left alone. So that is it for today. And for those of you who are in my in-person class, you will, before next class on September 11th, you should have completed Chapter 1 in the American Yawp. You should complete your reading quiz. And also make sure that you've read Chapter 1 in Going to the Source. For those of you in my online class, you should be doing all of these things as well. You just don't necessarily need to have them done by September 11th, but you should have read Chapter 1 and Going to the Source by Thursday so that you can participate and make your post in the week's discussion board. All right, take care, everybody. And for those of you who are in my in-person class, I'll see you later this week. And if you have any questions, post them in the discussion board, or please do, reach out to me via email. Thanks a lot.